Hey everybody, good to see you today and glad that you are once again sitting in a circle in a small group. We really believe life happens better in groups and certainly glad you're here. And certainly glad you're wanting to go and a little deeper and find a little more in this idea of generosity. It's been a great series. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have, talking about being generous, understanding that God has been generous to us, that God expects us to be generous to others. And in this week, we looked at something I believe maybe the key and maybe the part that's as important as anything here this third week. We talk about investing and that generosity is a good investment. Now, I don't know if you ever thought about it that way, but it really is a good investment. Now, all of us have made investments of some kind or another. Maybe you've made financial investments, maybe stocks, bonds. Maybe it's been investments of time and energy. Maybe you've invested in relationships. Maybe you've invested in some service area at church or in the community or at work or wherever it might be. We all make investments, and some are good and some are not so good. If you've ever made a bad investment, you know how difficult that is to deal with. And frankly, excuse me, I have to start over, Travis. Man. No, I'm okay now. I just caught something wrong. All right, let me try again. Hey everybody, glad to see you in group today and glad that you are back in a circle. We really do believe that life happens better when you're connected. And being connected in a circle and being able to talk about the scriptures, talk about needs in life, talk about doing life is very, very important. Well, we've just finished up a series called GeneroUS. We've looked at three big ideas for this series. First of all, we talked about the fact that God has been generous to us. Secondly, that God expects us to be generous. And then finally this week, we looked at the fact that generosity is a good investment. I don't know if you've looked at it that way before, but it really is. Now, all of us have made investments of some kind at some point in time. Maybe financial investments, or maybe you've never done that, but you've made investments of time and energy. You've invested in relationships, you've invested in places of service, maybe at church, maybe in the community, wherever it might be. Question is, will your investment really last? How long will it last? What about spiritual investments? That's what we're talking about really this week. Not so much financial, but spiritual. Several years ago, in about 2003 or 2004, I read a book that impacted me. You know, some books really impact you, others are just kind of, it was okay. This one impacted my life. It's called Eternity Portfolio. It's written by a man named Alan Gothard. Now, I don't know if you can actually still find the book in print today, so you might want to check that out. I think it's a powerful book that impacted me greatly because it taught me about making investments for eternity. Eternity Portfolio. And so that's what we're talking about this week. And I don't know how you feel about eternal investments, but that's something you want to talk about as a group. To go a little more today and get beyond verse 19, which really is the heart of the text we looked at this week, I want to go a little deeper into what Jesus said about spiritual investments. Just in case you think, well, I'm not sure if that's what Paul meant when he said that to Timothy. Well, listen, look at what Jesus said. I want to take you to two passages that Jesus spoke to his disciples. One of them is in Luke chapter 12. He's in the area, probably in the area of Judea, probably just outside of Jerusalem, not too far away. A crowd had gathered, a large crowd, by the way, had gathered. And we read that where Jesus begins to talk to them, and he does so in the part we're going to look at today by answering a question. Let me begin reading Luke chapter 12. Notice it says in verse 13, someone from the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now, not surprising to me, if you get a group of people together, they got questions about money. So the question arises about money, about an inheritance specifically. Jesus said, "Friend, who appointed me a judge or arbitrator over you?" In other words, wait a minute, that's not really the point of why I'm here. But he took the opportunity then to teach them a valuable lesson about money, particularly those who are wealthy. And remember, Paul said to Timothy, instruct those who are rich in this present age. and talked to them about the importance of investing in the coming age. So what did Jesus say? He told them this. He said, watch out and be on guard against all greed, because one's life is not in the abundance of his possessions. Jesus says you got to be careful, because one of the perils of wealth is greed. And if you're going to be wealthy, when you deal with riches, you're going to fall into that peril at some point or another. What is greed? I like Andy Stanley's definition, by the way. Andy says that greed is the assumption of consumption. Assumption of consumption. What he means by that is that when we have something, we assume that we are to consume it. But it may not be true. There may be some things we have not meant for our consumption, but rather meant for our generosity. So Jesus goes on to tell a parable to make a point. He says, a rich man's land was very productive. He thought of himself, what should I do since I don't have anywhere to store my crops? I'll do this, he said. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones and store all my grain and all my goods there. So this rich farmer has an abundance in his crop. His barns are full. He still has more. What can he do? Of course, he doesn't think about giving it away. He thinks, I'll build bigger barns. Now, that seems like a pretty decent business decision to me. But what happens next begins to reveal his heart. He says in the next verse, then, after I build my bigger barns and fill them, then I'll say to myself, you have many goods stored up for many years. Take it easy. Eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. And enjoy yourself. Wow, does he ever reveal his heart? Not only a heart of greed, but he also falls into the same perils that Paul mentioned to Timothy. We saw last week in verse 18, and those perils are clearly, be careful not to be arrogant or to trust in your own riches. Here he's doing all of them. So Jesus says, God says to him, you fool, this very night your life is demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? Jesus reminds us that wealth does not last. It's not lasting. It's fleeting. As a matter of fact, no matter how much we can consume, no matter how much we can put together, no matter how many possessions we have, all of it is temporary. And then he adds this word. That's how it is with the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Now, what does he mean by that? He says there's a folly in thinking we can build up and build up and build up for ourselves and enjoy it only on ourselves. We do not have things only for our consumption, but rather we build margin so that we can be generous. Now, and if there's another passage that Jesus talks about this, something very similar. Let me just take you there real quickly, and you can talk through these two passages when the video is just about done. Now look what he says. He's again talking to a large crowd. He's talking to a group of followers about anxiety and what's in our minds and what's in our heart. And here's what he says. Verse 19 of Matthew 6. He says, don't store up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth, rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. He says, if you store up treasures on the earth, if you build your barns and you fill them up, you got to know that everything we have is susceptible to rust, is susceptible to moth, and is susceptible to thieves. So what's the alternative? Notice the contrast. He says, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Wait, treasures in heaven, what does that mean? He says in heaven, watch this, moth or rust cannot destroy, and thieves can't break in and steal. And then he adds, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. I guess in a quick word and something for you to talk about today, to go a little bit deeper, talk about how can we make spiritual investments? How can we store up treasures in heaven? He contrasts this idea of building up treasures, building up our financial portfolio, if you will, our stock portfolio versus our eternity portfolio. Generosity is a great investment in the future. When I plant a tree, what am I looking for? I'm looking for fruit. An investment of seed, an investment of time to cultivate, water, and grow leads to the fruit that I'm going to enjoy later. I'm convinced that we can indeed store up treasure in heaven, and it begins with generosity. That's one of the ways that we store up treasure in heaven. Truth of the matter is, you've heard it said you can't take it with you. And it's true. You can't take it with you, but you can send it forward. Generosity is one of those investments that pays rich dividends. And while you may experience some of those dividends today, the real payoff is way in the future through eternity. Well, I think you'll probably be thankful for studying this passage one day. If it's in eternity, you'll appreciate it. Well, a lot to talk about. You guys have some fun. Pass through it, look through it, pick it apart, and then, before you finish, talk about how you and your group can be more generous next year than you were this year. It's a good investment. Bank on it.